Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a really fascinating study focused on Bayan Lepas over in Pulau Pinang, Malaysia. Now, if you know Bayan Lepas, you probably know it as this absolute powerhouse of an industrial and economic center. I mean, it's a booming hub of manufacturing. But hidden right beneath the surface of all that thriving economic wealth is a pretty surprising secret. Despite all the money being generated in the region, there are households silently struggling with severe financial challenges. So today, we're going to unpack exactly how that happens, and we'll look at a unique university study that actually used physical 3D modeling to bring this invisible issue into the light. It really begs the question, right? How does extreme poverty just hide in plain sight? How can a modern, wealthy economic center, one that's literally bursting with factories and tech parks, still have these undetected pockets of severe financial deprivation? It's a total paradox. You'd normally assume that a rising economic tide lifts all boats, but as we're going to see from the data, that just isn't always the case. Sometimes the brightest lights cast the deepest shadows, and these big, sweeping, district-level statistics, they can completely mask the reality of what's actually happening street by street. To really wrap our heads around this, we first need to redefine how we even look at poverty. Traditionally, in Malaysia, poverty's been measured using the poverty line income, or PLI, which is basically just looking at the absolute minimum cash you need to survive. But modern approaches use something called multidimensional poverty. This is the understanding that, poverty isn't just about a lack of income. It's about limited access to education, to healthcare, to decent housing, and even social participation. In rapidly growing urban areas like Bayan Lepas, the cost of housing and transport just skyrockets. So even if people do have jobs, their wages often just can't keep pace with those rising living costs. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Poverty in a modern hub. 2. Malaysia's historic poverty fight. 3. The binary income prototype. 4. Mapping hidden vulnerability. And finally, 5. Beyond the binary model. Let's jump right in. Okay, let's dive into this first section, poverty in a modern hub. The study highlights a few very specific, real-world factors that are trapping families in this area. First up is the harsh reality of low household income just battling against rising urban costs. Everything from groceries to rent goes up, which basically shrinks your purchasing power. Second is underemployment, so people working in low-paying jobs or informal sectors where there's zero job security. Then you've got education. Limited schooling directly lowers future earning potential, which kind of creates this generational trap. Add in large household sizes where maybe only 1 or 2 people are providing for a whole bunch of dependents, and those resources are stretched dangerously thin. And finally, external shocks. Things like the recent COVID-19 pandemic absolutely devastated these already precarious households with job losses and business closures. Moving on to Section 2, Malaysia's historic poverty fight. If we zoom out and trace the history, we see a really fascinating evolution of policy on a national level. Starting back in 1957 with the first Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, the focus was heavily on rural development. So building basic infrastructure, roads, electricity, water supply for farming communities. But then we see a major shift. In 1971, Tun Abdul Razak introduced the landmark New Economic Policy, aiming to eradicate poverty across all races and restructure economic imbalances. That was later strengthened by Tun Hussein Onn in 1976. But the most dramatic pivot happened starting in 1981. Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad shifted gears rapidly away from those purely rural initiatives and pushed toward intense industrialization. His Look East policy and Vision 2020 sparked this sudden, massive manufacturing growth that lifted a lot of incomes nationwide. And the timeline just continues to adapt to whatever the modern challenges are. Under Tun Abdullah Badawi in 2003, the focus shifted to enhancing human capital. By 2009, Datuk Seri Najib Razak brought in direct financial assistance alongside the Economic Transformation Program to help folks deal with rising living costs. When the pandemic hit hard in 2020, Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin's administration pivoted aggressively into crisis management, rolling out massive stimulus packages to protect jobs. Today, under Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, the strategy is guided by the Madani framework, which really emphasizes targeted subsidies and inclusive economic growth. The consistent thread running through all these different administrations, a continuous adaptation to the ever-changing face of poverty. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 3, the binary income prototype. Now, this is a brilliant way to handle data. Instead of just looking at boring lines on a spreadsheet, The researchers actually built a physical 10 by 10 grid model representing 100 observed households in Bayan Lepas. They designed it as a binary income poverty indicator, and the rules are incredibly straightforward. If a household has an income, it gets a 1 and is marked with a white indicator. But if the household has absolutely no income, it gets a 0 and is marked with a red indicator on this transparent grid. It's so clever because it transforms these abstract, easily ignored numbers into a tangible, immediate visual reality. And wow, the data they plugged into that physical model is incredibly jarring. Out of the 100 households sampled, right in the middle of this highly developed industrial hub, mind you, 79 had an income, but 21 households had absolutely zero income. That is a 21% poverty incidence rate of complete income deprivation during the observation period. Think about that. Roughly 1 out of every 5 households they surveyed was surviving with no active income source at all. Now, what's really interesting about this is Section 4, Mapping Hidden Vulnerability. The researchers took their prototype a step further by creating a 3D topographical cross-reference model. Basically, they took those same red and white pens and placed them onto a top-view density map of the Bayan Lepas geography. So you're looking at the mountains, the city streets, the coast, and doing this reveals something absolutely crucial. Those 21 zero-income households, they aren't clustered together in one isolated slum. The red pens are dispersed. They're scattered in these invisible pockets all across the area. They are literally living right next door to households that are doing just fine. And this brings us to a core motif of today's explainer, which is perfectly captured by a quote referenced in the study from researcher Ravelanian in 2019. Poverty conditions may remain hidden when analysis relies only on aggregated statistics. Basically, if a district has a generally high average income, the local government might look at their spreadsheets and think, hey, everything's perfect here. Sweeping national or district statistics average out all the extremes, completely hiding those scattered red pins. That is exactly why localized physical and spatial models are so vital. They reveal the things that the spreadsheets hide. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Beyond the Binary Model. When we step back and objectively contrast the pros and cons here, it's quite clear. What the binary prototype shows brilliantly is the immediate visual distribution of vulnerability. It's a real game changer because it allows policymakers to instantly spot those scattered pockets of zero-income households that need emergency financial assistance or food security right now. However, what it doesn't show is nuance. It doesn't show the severity of poverty for the people who actually do have an income. I mean, a household making barely enough to survive gets a white pin exactly the same as a millionaire does. It doesn't factor in household size, the specific local cost of living, or standard poverty line income metrics. Because of those limitations, the study suggests this prototype shouldn't just replace traditional metrics, but rather act as a really powerful preliminary step to solve problems efficiently. Step 1. Use the binary prototype to immediately and visually identify the most critically vulnerable households. Find the zeros. Step 2. Cross-reference that data with topographical maps so you can understand the spatial context and geography of the vulnerability. And finally, Step 3. Once you actually know where to look, then you deploy the comprehensive tools like the poverty line income or the multidimensional poverty index to measure the severity and craft highly targeted policy actions. Which leaves us with a final, somewhat provocative thought. We've seen how translating a simple spreadsheet into a physical grid and a topographical map revealed a totally invisible crisis in Bayan Lepas. It proves that how we look at data is honestly just as important as the data itself. So how might visualizing data differently change the way we solve problems in our own communities? The next time you hear a really broad, district-wide statistics thrown around, ask yourself, what scattered red pins might be hiding just out of sight? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the data around you.